think I recognize that man.
Which one?
The Colonel. That's Lenaris, Holem.
Lenaris. From the Ornathia resistance cell.
Met him at a reception in the capital about a year ago.
He's good.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Positively Trek Book Club with your hosts, Dan Gunther and Bruce Gibson. Bruce, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I read a book today that I finished, and I want to talk about it.
Excellent. Well, we're here to do just that. So, we're continuing our look at the final books that we have to cover in the Lost Era. And this one is the second book of the Terok Nor trilogy. And this one's called Night of the Wolves. This is the middle book of the trilogy, covering the years of the Bajoran occupation, the Cardassian Occupation of Bajor, I should say. And we're going to jump right into that. Of course, as you know from our most recent episodes, the first part of this episode will be spoiler-free. We'll talk about our thoughts of the book and if we recommend it or not. And then after a brief break, we'll go into spoilers and really dig down deep into this book. So, Bruce, you were saying before we started recording, you finished reading this book just today.
Yes, I did. I had 2 chapters left, and I read them today. And so I didn't get a chance to really sit there and think about it or skim through some parts like I usually do sometimes. But yeah, I found this book wasn't quite what I was expecting. I don't really know what I was expecting. I think I was expecting something that takes place immediately after the last book and involved more of those characters. So I would say I was pleasantly surprised by this book.
Right. Interesting. Okay. We'll have to get into that for sure. I've read this book, of course, before. I read it years ago and recently read it again and just kind of read the last 100 pages or so today as well. It was kind of down to the wire on it, but got it finished and wrote some of my thoughts down in the notes here. And I enjoy this book. I really liked it the first time around. It was fun to kind of revisit it and take another look at it here. We've got a lot of characters that are from the television show that we see what they're up to during the occupation, and a lot of characters that are brand new creations for this novel and for this trilogy as well. So one thing I wanted to do is give you recommended viewing to go along with this book, because a lot of books use ideas from episodes and that sort of thing. So I think there's a set of episodes that are great viewing for this novel. And these are all Deep Space Nine episodes. The first one I want to bring up is Duet from the first season of Deep Space Nine, probably the best DS9 episode of season 1. That's the one where the Cardassian who seems to be Guldar Heel comes to Deep Space Nine and is interrogated by Kira. And it's kind of a 2-person play back and forth between the two of them for most of the episode. And that one definitely applies to what happens in this novel. Thoughts on that episode, Bruce? Do your thoughts align with mine that it's one of the best episodes of early DS9?
Yeah, I would say so for sure. Because, even though I haven't gone through a whole rewatch since the first time the series was on and I watched it as it came out, I have watched season 1 fairly recently, and yeah, I would agree with that.
Right on. Well, from season 2, there's 2 episodes in season 2 that I think are definitely recommended viewing for this book. The first is The Alternate, which introduces us to the character of Dr. Mora Pol, who is the Bajoran scientist who studied Odo under the Cardassians. And Profit and Loss, which is kind of Deep Space Nine's take on Casablanca with Quark in the Humphrey Bogart role, and Professor Natima Lang, a Cardassian, who actually features quite a bit in this novel as well. So 2 early episodes that I think Profit and Loss is one of my favorite episodes in season 2. The Alternate, maybe not quite as good an episode, but definitely introduces you to that character.
Yeah, and then the next episode is Shakar, which is not my favorite episode.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah, this one...
I'm not a big fan of his.
Fair enough. This episode I put on this list, probably not for the reasons that people might think. We do see a bit of Shakar and the Shakar resistance cell in this novel, But the main reason I picked this episode is because it introduces us to a character named Lenaris Holem, who has a big part in the novel as well. And his part in that episode isn't huge, but I think if you watch that episode, you'll be pleasantly surprised about how much of what happens to Lenaris in this novel is taken from just a few lines in that episode. And I always love that. I always think that's fun.
Yeah, this is an episode I definitely want to watch now that I've read the novel. I mean, I've seen it before, but it's been a while. But it's one of those things where, I have a habit of reading the novels and then I want to go back and watch these episodes because I know more about these characters. I don't want to see how it is, what it's like watching the episode with this new information in my head.
So all of these episodes I've mentioned take place in the first 3 seasons of DS9, and there's one outlier on the list, and that is the episode Wrongs Darker Than Death or Night, which comes from season 6 of Deep Space Nine. And this episode details Dukat's relationship with Kira Meru, who is Kira Neris's mother, and we get a lot of that backstory in that episode, which plays heavily in this novel as well. So, if you haven't read the novel yet and you're just listening to the spoiler-free part, maybe check out those 5 episodes as well, or 1 or 2 of them if you want a little bit of supplemental viewing for your reading experience here.
It's interesting, though, that you're saying that because it makes me think of that as I'm reading this novel, I didn't feel like there was any big surprises. It was just more the things we've known about just playing out and actually seeing it.
There's definitely a bit of that. It's a prequel. It's stuff we've seen before. There are a couple connections that are made that take place in the novel that I think are a little bit of a nice kind of surprise that kind of tie things together. But like you say, nothing really groundbreaking for sure.
Yeah, story-wise, exactly.
Well, I'm just going to give my my recommendation. I like the first novel in this trilogy. I think this is a great novel for fans of Deep Space Nine who want a little bit of backstory and kind of building that world that was taking place before the series. I would definitely recommend this novel for DS9 fans and fans of Star Trek in general.
So the way I feel about this novel is that, the first novel, they feel very different to me because the first novel, there weren't as many familiar or well-known characters for me while I was reading it. Of course, it takes place further back in time, so it's going to have more current connection to Deep Space Nine than this novel would. And so we're being introduced to some of our major characters that we've seen in DS9. So these were more characters I was familiar with, but I would say at the same time, a lot of it felt a little too familiar. Like I said before, I knew how these storylines were pretty much going to play out, but in the first novel that we read, it was a little more unique to me. So It's not that I like one better than the other necessarily, they just feel different. I would definitely recommend this to a Deep Space Nine fan. I would say if somebody doesn't want to get too in the weeds of how all of this began, and you just want to find out more about the origins of some of the characters, then you could start with this and you don't necessarily have to read the first book. But if you're interested in the occupation and how it started up, I would definitely then read book 1 and then this one.
Well, we'll take a brief break here and come back with our spoiler-filled review of Terok Nor, Book 2, Night of the Wolves.
Thank you to you, our listeners, for supporting Positively Trek, and to especially our patrons on Patreon. If you would like to contribute to Positively Trek and be a patron on Patreon, visit patreon.com/positivelytrek. You'll get perks like early access to episodes and bonus content. And for those who are in the higher levels, you get shoutouts and associate producer credits and much more. And speaking of shoutouts, let's give a shout out to Carl Morris, Joyce Marin, Jim Stoffel, Dave Garcia, Rick Young, Paul D. Kinnear, and John Blaber. Thank you all for your support. Now let's go back to the show.
So, Night of the Wolves, like I said, this is the middle story of the trilogy, and I definitely noticed, to start out with, a big change in the storytelling style between the first book and this one. Of course, the first book was written by James Swallow. This one, Book 2 and Book 3 were written by S.D. Perry and Britta Dennison, so there's going to be some differences in storytelling just from the different styles of the authors. But overall, I noticed one big difference between this and the previous book, and you kind of touched on it a little bit before, that there's, some changes. We're getting closer to the more quote unquote modern era of Deep Space Nine that we see in the series. But even more basic than that, for me, Day of the Vipers, the first book, there seemed to be this very clear narrative progression of this story, that there was kind of one single story being told. And we kind of branched off and did different side quests, side stories, I guess, throughout. But there was kind of this main through line. Whereas in this novel, it feels more like a snapshot of events during this period. Like, we'll jump over here with this group for a while, and we'll jump over here. And it kind of goes from one story to the next, giving the reader an overall look at the occupation. Did you find that you enjoyed that kind of change in the way the story was told, or did you prefer book ones?
Gosh, that's a really good question. It didn't bother me that it was going between the different storylines. I mean, typically there's a certain rhythm in a novel where maybe, let's say, there's 3 or 4 storylines, and you hit storyline 1, then 2, 3, 4, and you come back 1, 2, 3, 4. This one seemed to be like 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 1. But like, it just seemed to go wherever it wanted to go. It didn't mess it up necessarily for me. I was just at times surprised that we were going back to a certain storyline after just reading that previously to the last one or whatever. And then there were certain storylines like Opaka that just kind of dwindled off. Like, we had, it ended earlier, and then new storylines started afterwards. So I don't know if I prefer one or the other necessarily. I guess in most cases I would say the style of book 1 is what I would usually prefer. But because this seemed more of like a historical document of these different events with all the different characters, I'm expecting that, and I don't know because I haven't read book 3, I'm expecting this is kind of showing all the different pieces, and then they kind of all add up together in book 3.
Yeah, and I mean, not wanting to really spoil book 3, but I think it's not too much of a spoiler to say that book 1 kind of stands on its own a little bit, and book 2 and 3 are kind of almost like a part 1 and 2 of these stories that we're getting now, if that makes sense.
I kind of guessed that because it's the same authors, right?
Yeah, and like you said, some of the stories just seem to kind of stop, and then, again, not necessarily spoiling, like a lot of those will be picked up again in book 3 because they're ongoing things that are going to continue. But yeah, it's definitely noticeable in here that there's more of a to be continued than there was from book 1, if that makes sense.
Yes, because I was on the last chapter, and as I was getting towards the end, I thought, is it going to say to be continued? Because there's something here in the epilogue that hasn't been resolved, and I've been kind of wondering about it, and sure enough, it says to be continued in book 3.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned the epilogue because, again, I read these a few years ago, and I was like, I didn't really remember this epilogue here and all of this. So it's interesting what's going to be picked up in book 3. So I'm eager to pick that one up and get going on that too. So
yeah, and we'll be doing that soon, which is pretty exciting.
For sure. Well, we'll stick with this one for now. Like I said, we've got a lot of characters in here that we see from the series, and a lot of, small names, but also big names, of course. Big ones including we see Kira Nerys and Laren, and even a brief glimpse at she would become Kai Wynn at one point. And Opaka plays a big role in this novel. She's a Vedic at this time and has some issues with the way the church is going. And the church, of course, the Church of Bajor, the prophets being led by Gar Osen, who we know from the last novel is not who he appears to be. So it's funny, there are some threads picked up from the last novel that continue on through, but for the most part, the characters we're seeing are different from the ones in that novel. Although we do get a brief return of Dara Mace, which I actually did not remember when I was rereading this. I was like, oh, I forgot that he comes back. That was really cool.
Yeah, it was nice to see him because he was one of my favorite characters in the last novel. And so we got a little bit of him here or there in this one. There are certain storylines in here that after I read this, I thought back on it. Like you said, Opaka and of course, like Odo and such are in here. But I would almost say that I'd want to see more of those stories played out maybe in their own novels. You know, like more of an Odo origin novel and a Opaka origin novel. Like I wanted, and maybe I'll feel, it's not that I wasn't fulfilled, but I just felt like, and maybe I'll feel different even after book 3, but I just felt like those characters themselves really could deserve a whole story novel themselves.
I feel like you've hit on something that echoes how I feel a little bit about this, in that there's a lot going on in these books, and it's easy for some stories to kind of get lost in the shuffle, it feels like. And like for me, just putting together the notes for this episode, I forgot to put anything down about Lenaris Holem and his whole part of the book, which is a major part of the book, mostly in the first 2/3 of it. He's kind of drops off a little bit towards the end. But also I forgot to put in stuff about Opaka and her story with what's going on, which is another major part of the book. So yeah, it feels like these stories could deserve more of a focus in their own book, maybe, or something like that. And in this kind of big, huge, expansive history of the occupation, there's just so much going on that they kind of get a little lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, because Opaka, and I keep bringing up Opaka for some reason, even though she's not a big part of this book, but like you said, like in the first half of it or so, she's a fairly prominent character. And Lenaris is also, like you said, in the first 2/3, and then it's like we get Laren in the last half or third, and same with Kira. It just seemed to, like, when you're starting the book, you almost assume that when we're starting off with certain characters, they're going to play out through the end of the book, but then they start to drop off and others start to appear in their own storylines. But it kind of works too, because the years shift. So as the years shift, maybe one story isn't followed up on because we're moving to another year and a new story is starting up.
Yeah. And adding to that, of course, with the years going by, you know, we see like maybe a little kid Kira in something early on. And then as the years go by, she's coming into her own and growing into an adult. And then we see her taking on her role in the resistance, for example. So yeah, it kind of makes sense that because the story is so, it spans so many years, you know, it kind of has to keep moving on, which, you know, I don't think it's a bad thing, especially when you take this in combination with the next book and we get to see the end of the story eventually. But for right now, just where it leaves off, it can have a bit of a disjointed feeling.
Yeah, and I like how Laren is 14 and Kira's younger, and then we jump ahead to the next set of years, and then we get Kira at 14, you know, which is like when people become adults.
Yeah, a very important year in the Bajoran tradition. Well, we've brought up Opaka a bit, so let's I'm going to jump around in the order that I have the notes in a little bit, but let's talk about her part in this story here, because we have the Bajoran society that follows the Dajaras, the caste system, right? If you're born into a particular caste, you do the job of that caste. So if you're a family that's artists, you're expected to continue to be artists and pilots and whatever else there is out there, engineers, that kind of thing. But with the Cardassian occupation, a lot of people are feeling like that tradition no longer has a place, that Bajor requires their people to do what needs to be done regardless of what Dajara they're in. And the Bajoran faith, which is kind of, it's led by this Kai, but it's influenced by Gar Osen, who isn't really Gar Osen. He's an Obsidian Order agent. They're trying to maintain the status quo, right? The Dajaras, because it's keeping Bajor segregated and not uniting. Meanwhile, Vedic Opaka, who we will see become Kai Opaka in Deep Space Nine in the pilot episode, she starts to believe that the Dajars don't have a place in modern Bajor and that people need to unite and not necessarily fight the Cardassians, because as a religious person, she's not a believer in violence, but rise up and be unified against the Cardassian presence. So she finds herself kind of on the opposite side of the Bajoran faith, and basically gets excommunicated at one point, or not quite excommunicated but from the church, but she has her title revoked, and she kind of goes and starts preaching to the masses this message of leaving the Dajars behind, even though it's against what the prevailing faith believes. What did you think of Opaka's story here?
I enjoyed it because that she is going with what she believes and not what the church, for the most part, tells her. This is a very turbulent time of discovery for the Bajorans of where they fit in, what works and what doesn't. And so their society starts to shift. And she starts to realize that the way things are today the old ways don't work. And in order to unite and be on a united front against the Cardassians, this caste system needs to go out the window. And even though the church is saying, no, you got to keep it, she's willing to make her stand. And I really love the scenes that involve her son Vassal in that, because he's encouraging her and he's on board with it. And I love that they live in this, little house, that has a history with the church, and she doesn't want to lose the house, but then she's kicked out and she's willing to move on and get her messaging out there. So it was interesting to see someone who we know becomes a prominent leader later being removed from that leadership, but taking her own personal leadership to lead the people. So I really enjoyed that story.
Yeah, me too. I really loved the conviction of her faith, like how she goes to the Kai with these concerns, or goes to Gar Osen with these concerns, and is basically told, like, you can't preach this stuff or you're going to be out. And I feel like a lesser person would have been like, well, okay, I guess I better keep my mouth shut and toe the company line. But it's not even a question for her. She's like, oh, okay, well, I guess I have to go out on my own then. Like, she doesn't even entertain the possibility of going against her own convictions. Like, she doesn't even think about, well, I have to compromise my beliefs then. No, she's like, okay, well, then I guess I have to leave. I love that. That's just the strength of her convictions and her faith there.
And what adds to it is that the Kai who was against it comes around to agree with her. Mm-hmm. So agreeing and starting to understand and coming to that way of saying, hey, you know what? I think she was right all along. That's great to see too, because you can see that she held to her beliefs. She was right. And then it's acknowledged that she was right. Now, of course, that doesn't play out well for the Kai, but, because of Gar Osen. But I really like this story.
Yeah, the Kai coming around to that, like you said, and Gar Osen. That's another one of those scenes where he's in such danger. And you just wish you could reach into the page and be like, dude, turn around. You need to know what's coming. And so Gar Osen is trying to convince the Kai, no, you can't go against this. And Kai's like, no, I've come around to the way Opaka's thinking, and I'm going to announce publicly that Bajor should renounce the Dajars. And it's like, you may leave, Gar. And I was like, okay. And then, of course, Gar just up and strangles the Kai. And oh, man, that was brutal.
It was. Oh, who's the Kai now? Was that identified?
I think they hadn't chosen the Kai. Actually, it's kind of, Opaka is kind of named the Kai towards the end, but not like officially. It's basically like, everyone's going to follow her, so she's now the Kai. Yeah. That was interesting.
Yeah, that wasn't really clarified if that was official or not. Well, I guess I assume it is. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that in the next book.
Yeah, for sure. Well, there's a lot of turmoil happening with the Bajoran faith just generally, with Dukat's new edicts that the Bajoran religious officials can't counsel to the workers anymore, and they have to register as workers themselves and that kind of stuff. So it feels like the Bajoran faith is kind of going underground. So I can't imagine there'll be like an official election for the Kai this time around. It'd just be like the faithful people all say, yeah, it's her, and they follow her. So yeah, it's kind of what it felt like.
You know, when we're talking through the storyline and I'm just looking through the notes at the others, it dawned on me that this novel could have also worked as a set of short stories. Instead of having them all play out one after the other, scene to scene, back and forth, you could take all those different segments of the storylines and put them together and make short stories.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it almost feels like it is kind of a set of short stories set in the occupation here. So,
yeah.
I mean, it's all together in that it all happens in the occupation, but a lot of these stories don't necessarily impact the other stories directly in a lot of ways. They're kind of all set in the same environment and the same set of circumstances are producing them, but they're all very different experiences.
Yeah. No, but there are times where some of them, there are certain circumstances where they do kind of play off of each other every once in a while, so it makes better sense to play it out this way.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of stories that kind of play off each other and intersect a bit, we also have these two young Cardassian students who are studying at a Cardassian university and both become kind of interested in Bajor. And one of them is wanting to learn about Bajoran soil. So she discovers there's this artifact that has some Bajoran dirt on it and gets a sample. And it turns out, of course, to be one of the orbs that was captured by the Obsidian Order in the last novel. And she's exposed to this orb and starts having dreams and is compelled to look at the orb again. And she has this mysterious figure come to her in a dream and this orb experience, this vision, and learns that she is the next like guide for the Cardassian Aurelian religion that we saw kind of meet its end in the last novel, but there's remnants basically of it. And she's supposed to lead this resurgence of it. And one of the things she sees in one of these experiences is Vedic Gar strangling the Kai. And of course, she realizes in this vision that he's not a Bajoran, he's actually a Cardassian. And she sees all of this play out in real life and realizes that these are more than just dreams, that these experiences are real. And she changes her name to Astraea. I'm not sure if that's the right pronunciation. And this all kind of interestingly links into A Stitch in Time, the Garrick novel written by Andrew Robinson that talks about the Aurelian religion and all that sort of stuff. So what did you think of this whole aspect of the story here?
This was very intriguing to me. I would say that I started to get probably more invested in this story than some of the others. And not that I wasn't invested in all of them, but this one really perked my interest. You know, I just found it fascinating that this is a student that is Cardassian and she's having this experience with an orb. And I wanted to see how this plays out for someone like her and how this may change her view of the Bajorans and the occupation and everything's going on. And then it's this mystic thing that's going on and a bit of a little mystery to it. And, you know, this is the way, you know, for her. and this is how the book ends. I mean, we don't really get the conclusion to this. This goes into the epilogue. So actually, as the last few chapters were playing out, I forgot about the storyline. It wasn't really touched on until we get to the epilogue. I was like, oh yeah, I want to know what's going to happen with this. So this was just very intriguing to me.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting characters and her kind of journey is really fascinating. The kind of realization of a different path for Cardassia and for Cardassians. And one of the things that both she and the Aurelian priest from the first book, one of the things they both experience is this vision of Cardassia in ruins and destroyed. And we know, of course, that comes from the series finale of Deep Space Nine, when the Dominion levels a lot of Cardassia, right? So they see that these events here, the Bajoran occupation and all of this, will eventually lead to that. And it's sad that we know they won't be able to necessarily divert Cardassia off of that course. But we know from novels that follow the end of the Deep Space Nine finale that that future can be changed into a new, brighter one for Cardassia eventually. But it's neat how it's all linking to everything, even the post-finale novels that come after and stuff.
It was interesting to me also that she runs into this officer, this Cardassian, and she thinks like, oh, she's going to get in trouble. And it's this guy Sakat, and he takes her back to his camp or whatever it is. And it just, I don't know, that whole thing was, because he recognized when she said the name, he realized, oh, we've been waiting for you. This is the way. Yeah, I'm going to keep saying that. But, and takes her back to his people and all this. And then she's like, oh my gosh, am I like this spiritual leader now? Am I this person that they've been waiting to guide them and all these things? I don't know. I just found that interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of mystery there. And I found that really fascinating as well. This kind of secret underground Aurelian way worshippers or something. And the kind of link that might have to the Bajoran religion somehow. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to seeing that more explored in the third book as well, because like a lot of the stories here, it just kind of ends, and then there's obviously more to come. Well, we've mentioned him already, but he's a significant part of this book, the Bajoran resistance member Lenaris Holem, and his experience with the Ornathia resistance cell. And I alluded to this in the first part of the episode when I talked about the episode Shakar. And it's actually just a really small part of the episode Shakar when Kira and Shakar and all of them are up in the hills running from the provisional government soldiers. The soldiers are led by Lenaris Holem, and they're looking at him through the binoculars, and they're like, oh, that's Lenaris Holem. He was in the Ornathia resistance cell. He led the first successful off-world raid, the raid on Pullock 5. Yeah, oh yeah, I remember that. He's a resistance hero. And that's it. Like, that's basically what this whole experience in this novel is built out of, is just those few lines in that episode. And I love how they take that and expand on the story here. And we've got him as having been a member of a resistance cell, but that ended badly, so he left. Then he gets recruited by this Ornathia group because they have this warp ship they want to fix up and use in campaigns, and he might have connections with his old cell and all of this. And that whole story I found really interesting, just with the whole culture of the Bajoran resistance and how they're moving away from the traditions and that kind of thing, and all becoming fighters regardless of what walk of life they came from and stuff. And then his whole romance with this woman named Terok, who's engaged to this other guy, and that kind of crosses over into a different story that we'll get to later. I found that all really fascinating. I was really invested in this character, kind of in the same way I was invested in Dara Mace in the first book. He kind of fills that role a bit in this novel, I found.
That's a good call. I agree. Yeah, he does kind of feel like he's that type of character for this book, because at first he's resistant to join them. And like you said, he's done this kind of thing before. And so he kind of goes along with it, and because he says, yeah, he can help them find this person they're looking for and all that. And it just all plays out. He meets the one guy's sister, and oh, wow, she's quite attractive and kind of like her or whatever. But, oh, she's engaged to this Sifa guy. And, it just was nice just to kind of see a group of resistant fighters all getting together, working together. What's their mission going to be? You see them planning things out. Oh, maybe if we do it this way. Oh, no, that's not going to work. Oh, we'll be caught if we go up in the ship and we do that. And so that was almost like showing you the day-to-day life of a resistance cell that's trying to figure out what's the next plan of action and how do we do this without any Cardassians finding out what we're trying to do and leading us to our camp and so on and so forth. And then Terrell's brother, is that Lack or whatever, he gets captured and imprisoned and they have to go save him. And you think that, oh, maybe, you know, they'll get through and save him, but they fail at that, you know. It's and her brother actually gets executed as a result of that going on along with the other prisoners. So yeah, I found the whole storyline to be very informative of what a cell like this would be like during this time.
Yeah, that whole story I found really fascinating, and specifically that raid as well on this off-world prison camp on Pullock 5 to rescue her brother, who has already been executed by this point. They just don't realize it. They have that mission there, and they come back and they feel like they failed, right? The prisoners weren't there. They were taken by surprise quickly and had to retreat. And they feel like this is a big, huge failure. And I remember reading that and thinking, it's funny that it was held in such reverence in the episode when they talk about the first successful off-world raid. And I was like, oh, that's weird. But then you see, like, yeah, they didn't do what they set out to do, but they blew the crap out of that camp. And it was a huge operation, like, to get this ship working and to fly off somewhere in a different star system and make an attack there. Like, that really was a huge logistical and tactical win for the Bajoran resistance that was able to kind of show the rest of the resistance that they were capable of something like that. And it probably inspired so many people to pick up arms and fight against the Cardassians that of course it would be regarded as a success. So I loved that whole story. And then the whole kind of propaganda angle of it that they were able to use afterwards. It was just so much fun. And it felt very realistic that, like, yeah, that's exactly how that would play out. You know, you feel like this was a disaster, but really look at what you accomplished. That was huge.
Yeah. No, it was good. This to me felt more like it was the main storyline of the book. Because I think maybe it was the one that played out the longest.
Yeah, I think that makes sense for sure. Yeah, it definitely has a through line. And we see Lenaris Holem at different stages throughout the years that it covers. We kind of follow him the longest.
Yeah, yeah. So he almost felt like he was the major character. But like you said earlier, it kind of concludes itself 2/3 of the way in the book. You know, so it's kind of weird, but yeah, I was satisfied though with that storyline.
Absolutely. Well, we talked about these different storylines kind of crisscrossing and involving other parts of the storyline. Now, this fiance of Terrell is named Sifa, like you mentioned, and when Terrell and Lenaris and all of them decide that they're going to go to Pullock 5 and try to rescue Lack, he leaves, this Sifa guy, because he doesn't believe they have success. He thinks the Cardassians are going to descend on them at any moment. And he takes off for this area of land that his family lives on, hoping that Terrell will follow him. But she doesn't. She goes on this mission. And while he's there, these two Cardassian women visit the vineyards there. And one of them is Natima Lang, who, as I mentioned, we see in the episode Profit and Loss. She has a whole romance with Quark at some point that we haven't seen yet, but is, I'm thinking, still to come. And her friend, who is Damar's betrothed. And Damar, of course, from the Deep Space Nine series as well. We see him as a young officer here. And they cross paths with the Sifa guy, and Sifa panics and takes them hostage, and Damar's betrothed gets injured, and Natima Lang works with the Bajoran to try and dig them out of these caverns that they've become trapped in and all of this. So that was an interesting story. And I have always really liked the character of Natima Lang, and I like that she gets such a big role in this as well, because kind of like Astraea's story, but through a different method, Natima Lang is starting to get a little disillusioned with how Cardassian society is and how Cardassia is treating Bajor. And we see kind of the beginnings of that evolution in this part of the story here.
And she's working with Sifa to get out of this trapped corridor, this tunnel that they're in. And yeah, Damar's girlfriend, Vija Katan, is trapped and she's almost unconscious. She's been hurt, and they're trying to save her life, and they're running out of light, and they're digging, and we see, Sifa and Natima fighting, arguing with each other. We need to do this. No, we need to do that. We need to, whatever. And so they have to work together. But I have to say that out of everything in this novel, this was the storyline that had a scene that really made me jump in my seat.
Oh, really?
Being surprised, because when the Cardassians come to rescue them, and here's Sifa, who's been trying to help save his life and the two Cardassians, and the first thing the Cardassians do is shoot him, and he's dead. Like, just immediately.
And that's Damar that pulls the trigger there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they didn't even come and go like, is everybody okay? Who are you? Or, I mean, here he is helping to try to save Damar's girlfriend. It's just like, oh, look, a Bajoran. I was like, whoa, like there was not even an exchange of words, it was just like, just knock him off. And and the thing is, Sifa knew. He was afraid. He was telling them while they were trapped in there, if we do communications and they come down, they're going to kill me. I don't want to communicate. I want to just try to get out of here on our own. So that actually made me kind of jump in my seat when I read that. I was like, whoa, did that just happen?
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because rereading this novel, there's not, like, I remember bits and pieces, and I don't really remember everything very clearly. And, when I'm reading something, I'm like, oh yeah, I kind of vaguely remember that whole time that they're in that cave and they're arguing. I remembered exactly what happens at the end of that scene. And I knew that as soon as Damar and that other soldier get there, he just gets shot. And that's tough, like reading that and knowing that that's coming, because, that's like, obviously the first time I read it, that must have just stuck so hard in my mind, that image of that happening, that like, I just remember that so clearly.
Yeah, I think years from now, if I ever reread this novel, I think the same thing's going to happen. I'll remember when I get to that scene. I know where this is going. I'll remember it. But I don't remember that after that, if the other two Cardassians that were trapped with him ever said anything to Damar about, why did you shoot him? I don't think they ever even argued, like, why would you do that? He was trying to save her life. Why did you shoot him? Like, they just like, okay, well, he's dead. Oh, well. Like, they didn't care.
Absolutely. We do see the seeds of something planted in Natima Lang's mind, though, because some of the arguments that Sifa makes about Cardassian orphans versus Bajoran orphans and that sort of thing. And in this whole incident, Vija, or however you say her name, I'm not sure, it's revealed that due to her injuries, she won't be able to bear children, which means that her engagement to Damar is now over, because a Cardassian woman that can't bear children is not worth having as a wife, because that is the whole reason, and even Cardassian orphans, if they don't have living parents, they're discarded, basically, because family is everything on Cardassia. And Natima is starting to question this. She says, like, why can't Damar and Vija still make a go of it and look after some of these kids? Like, she wants nothing more than to be a mother, and she can be. And she starts to kind of say this to Damar, and Damar's face is like, what? And she's like, never mind. Forget I said anything. I gotta go. Bye.
Yeah.
It's just such an alien concept to the Cardassians.
It was like he was so offended. Like, how dare you suggest such a ugly thing, like adoption of a kid? Like
almost to the point where it's perverse.
Yeah.
Like, he's so appalled by it.
Yeah, and she quickly knows, like, oh yeah, I shouldn't have said anything. Forget what I just said. Like, I'm so sorry. Yeah. But at the same time, he's there as his fiance, or is, recovering, and he needs to be there with her, and he wants to be there when she wakes up and all these things. And there's Dukat, like, why would he even bother? Like, she can't even bear children anymore. Like, he's wasted his time visiting his girlfriend when he should be here on the station working with me on this whatever situation that's going on. You know, I mean, he's just a cold-hearted Cardassian.
Yeah, absolutely. That was one thing I found interesting was Damar and Dukat's relationship. And as I'm talking about this, I'm looking at my wall and I see a signed photo of Damar signed by Casey Biggs, and just that, what a great character. Anyway, this hero worship that Damar has for Dukat, and like, it's so easy to remember Damar as he is at the end of the series, where he's telling Cardassians to rise up against the Dominion and stuff. And I always forget the like toady Damar period, where like if we see during the season 6 period where the Cardassians and the Dominion have retaken Deep Space Nine, this is the Damar from that time still, where he's just like a bootlicker to Dukat for most of the time, right? Like when Weyoun is insulting Dukat and Weyoun walks out and Damar's like, you shouldn't have to put up with that. He doesn't understand how great you are, or something like that. Like, that's the Damar we get in this story. And that was fun to kind of see that, and also see that Dukat just does not care. Like, you know, he's taken Damar under his wing, but he has no compassion for him or his situation or anything. He just sees how Damar is useful to him, basically.
Yeah. No, I was getting those vibes of the early DS9 Damar in this for sure, you know? And Dukat's always Dukat.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Dukat, we get a significant chunk of the novel kind of talking about Dukat on the station and with Meru, Kira Nerissa's mother. And we've mentioned, of course, we see Kira as a young kid, and she has this encounter with a Cardassian soldier, and, you know, he's kind of bullying these kids and asks for their names. And she says, I'm Kira Neris, and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, Kira? Oh, crap. We're supposed to leave the Kira family alone. Okay, go on. Just get out of here. And we find out that, yeah, Kira has basically been protected throughout her life because of Dukat's relationship with Meru, which there's a portion towards the end of the novel that I think gets continued in book 3. The part that I was remembering as we were getting close to it, I'm like, wait, I think that actually happens in book 3, but we see the beginnings of it here, where Kira is basically protected throughout her whole life, even as a member of the Resistance, because of Dukat's relationship with her mother.
Yeah, Dukat's a very interesting character because not just the protection of Kira, but how he wants to be loved by Bajorans, you know? And again, I mean, these are things we've learned in this series too, of his back history with them. And like, you know, I was good to the Bajorans. Why would they hate me? What, you know, and even
why is there no statue of me on Bajor?
Right. I mean, O'Brien gets a statue. Why not me? But, you know, it's like, he just, even like people that work with him, other Cardassians, just roll their eyes at him like, gee, like what are you trying to do? Why do you need them to love them? Why do you need to treat them so well? And of course, he's not really treating them well. I guess you could say he's treating them better than some other Cardassians would. But here again, like, he's protecting the Kira family because, you know, this woman is his mate on the station, even though he's married and his wife's not around, but this is his plaything. But he has feelings for her. He does love her in his own way. And I guess she kind of has a bit of feelings for him too, in a weird kind of way. And I don't know. It's just, the whole thing is so weird that I just have to wonder that when this TV series started, was this something they came up in the backstory that they were going to use later? Or I have to assume that it was something developed later, but who would have ever thought that you would take the Kira Nerys character and establish that her mother was a lover of Dukat's? I mean, that's just so messed up.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so fitting for his character, though, that like he can do all this on the one hand and be so magnanimous, and he promised Meru that he would look after the family, so he will continue to do so forever. And at the same time, he's like, well, these Bajorans, ship them off to Dr. Krell Moset and he can do his experiments on them. In the same breath as like saying like, oh, I allow the Bajorans so much freedom and blah, blah, blah. It's like, he's so self-deluded and he does just enough to make himself feel good about what he's doing. And at the same time is doing all these horrible things that he's just able to kind of compartmentalize it and like not realize how horrible that is. And it's disgusting. Oh, he's so disgusting.
And then you have Basso, who's collaborating and serving Dukat, who's a Bajoran. And he's like almost 100% Cardassian the way he acts in a way, it's like he's supporting everything Dukat wants to do, but he also is playing Dukat, to kind of get his way with things. And he's helping to oversee the Kira family and stuff. And that guy actually made me a little more disgusted than Dukat.
Yeah, you can see why the Resistance has such a huge problem with collaborators, right? Like the collaborators are almost worse than the Cardassians, it seems. Like they betrayed their own people. And Basso, another one, just a minor character we see in the episode Wrong's Darker Than Death or Night, and we see a lot more of him in this novel and gets fleshed out quite a bit for sure.
Yeah, I didn't like him.
No, he's pretty terrible for sure. Yeah, so we get Kira and her time with the Resistance a little bit. And we'll come back to that right at the end because that's kind of the last major thing in the novel. But I also want to talk a little bit about Laren. And I thought her journey in this novel was really fascinating because she's a young Bajoran orphan who basically hooks up with the Resistance at a really young age and starts doing things with the Resistance for her young age that she probably shouldn't be doing. She's robbed of her childhood, basically. And I feel like she's representative of the generation of Bajorans coming up during this time. The loss of their culture, like she doesn't believe in the religion at all. The occupation has basically robbed that entire generation of their childhood and their innocence. And all the anger and hatred she has towards the Cardassians is kind of a microcosm of what Bajor as a whole feels towards the Cardassians. I really enjoyed seeing her in this novel and the journey she's on. And, from these really incredibly violent things that she has to do juxtaposed with like, hey, that boy is kind of cute and I have these weird feelings, things that a kid that age should be feeling and experiencing, alongside all this horrible stuff she has to go through. It was really, in a lot of ways, heartbreaking and sad, but, just we know where the character is going to end up for better or for worse. And to see this formative period was brutal.
It really helps to define who the character is that we see later. It starts to make even more sense. And the fact that she doesn't really have her family anymore and she has like this uncle or whatever that's overseeing her, and she almost feels used by the Resistance, like because she's this great hacker. She can hack into security systems and stuff. And it's like, okay, do they keep me around because they like me or do they keep me around because they need me? And so I think all of a sudden she's just of this opinion of, I'm on my own. I don't feel like anybody really loves me necessarily. I'm not sure. I can't trust them. I can't trust the prophets. Like everything's just kind of going to hell. And I just have to take care of myself and do my own thing because I'm really on my own. And so that's why when we see her later in TNG, she's more of a bit of a rebellion of like, and protective. She's got the wall up in front of her of like, hey, I got this. Trust me, because I can only trust in myself. I can't trust in others. And of course, it takes her some time to start trusting in Picard and others. But I liked how they played this out.
Me too. And there's a couple things I enjoyed. Like, for example, we've seen Ro at this age because of the episode where they all got turned into kids. So, we know what Ro kind of looks like. So I was kind of casting that young actor in my head playing Ro at this time. And also we kind of see a little bit of an explanation as to how she probably got into Starfleet Academy and graduated, because she is so adept at, these computer systems and stuff. She's obviously very intelligent, very quick to learn things. You can see how a mind like that would succeed at the Academy. So it's like, oh, okay, Starfleet. Yeah, that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, because she also doesn't trust her resistance cell, because they put her on a mission to plant a bomb on a Ferengi ship to help even blow up Terok Nor, and there's Bajorans on the station. She comes to realize that they're just like, well, the sacrifices those lives will make will save, millions, but we'll get to Dukat. Like, that's the thing. We'll get to Dukat. Yeah, Bajorans will die, but we'll get to Dukat. Then she starts to realize this isn't the right way to do this. I mean, we're sacrificing other people's lives, innocent lives of Bajorans. There's got to be another way. Unlike what happens with the Kira storyline, where they do whatever they can to save lives. She's in a resistance cell that says, oh, no, we can sacrifice lives. So it kind of makes sense for her to say, I want to go to maybe find something in Starfleet, because they're going to find a more logical way to help save lives. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. To be fair, it's not the resistance cell that does that, though, because that's basically this boy she likes. That was his whole idea.
True. Yeah.
And the resistance cell seems kind of against doing that kind of thing, but she's still, it definitely alienates her from her fellow Bajorans to see that, like, they're capable of doing that kind of thing and stuff. So
yeah, that guy Biss, and I think he had a couple friends that were like supporting him in that. Yeah,
back on Valo too. Yeah, so I can see how she would be disillusioned by a lot of those opinions and those actions, for sure. So I can't remember if we pick up her story in book 3 or not, or if it's just like she's clearly off to join Starfleet or find something at this point. I can't remember if we pick up her story again.
Oh, I hope so, though. I want her story.
Yeah, I would love just a Laren at the Academy novel or something like that. I'd love to see that. I think that'd be really interesting.
I know. I was just thinking, if it's not in this next story, then I hope there's a book out there that is addressed, like her time joining Starfleet, and there may be one. I've just never read it.
Yeah, me neither. That'd be pretty cool. Well, there's a couple other things that I want to touch on. The first is Odo, and we see very early in the book him being discovered, and then it isn't until quite late in the book that the Cardassians are like, oh, right, we have this sample. Give it to Dr. Mora. Have him try and figure it out. And Dr. Mora, who we see in the Deep Space Nine series, studies Odo and eventually realizes he's sentient. And we get some interesting things about him working with the Cardassians, and his lab partner basically ends up being an unwitting collaborator, helping run the Gallitep labor camp and all this stuff. And Odo's very kind of briefly involved in that. And we see that Odo gets a glimpse of Kira much earlier than we thought too. That was kind of fascinating.
Yeah, that was kind of cute. I mean, it was real brief, but yeah, I thought that was pretty clever. This is the storyline that I really wanted to see fleshed out more, because it's not so much about Odo, it's more about Dr. Mora. But I wanted to know more about Odo. It's like, okay, well, Odo is kind of being born and tested through this and discovering himself, and we're not really seeing so much of that storyline of him. But now that I'm talking about that, I guess that's really addressed in Deep Space Nine in that episode with Mora. Like, maybe that story doesn't need to be told in this book, but I will say that, like you said, when they discovered Odo early, I was like, oh, that's Odo that they just discovered. And then I kept waiting for something to happen. I was like, are they going to even address Odo, or is that it? And then they finally got to this point with the lab and him being in the lab and poked at and stuff. But again, that's one of those stories that I think would be interesting in its own book, is just Odo in the lab with Mora and learning who he is, or he doesn't really know he is, but just kind of discovering, what he is or what he's doing and what's his place and who are these people. And I just think that would be an interesting story.
Yeah. Well, I will say, look out for book 3. There's more to come for Odo, for sure.
Good.
Which I guess you could probably tell from the cover of book 3, but yeah, still.
That's true. He is on the cover, isn't he?
Absolutely. Well, finally, the last kind of major thing in the novel, before the epilogue anyway, is the Gallitep labor camp run by Guldar Heel. And we see that being a big focus in the Deep Space Nine episode Duet. And we know that the Shakaar resistance cell was involved in liberating it. And we see all of that happen in this novel here. It's kind of the final big set piece of the novel. I really enjoyed this part, kind of seeing it play out here. It sounds like it was just a hellhole, and you know, the treatment of the Bajoran laborers was so horrible. And we hear that described in the Deep Space Nine episode, but to really just kind of see it play out in this novel, I thought the authors did a really excellent job of bringing that to life and showing Kira and the Shakaar resistance cell and their role in liberating that camp.
Yeah, and the terror in the Bajorans, you know, I mean, Kira's not expecting them to be so terrified, but she's not aware of the fire pit and all whatever's going on in this place, and they're all freaking out, and they're afraid they're going to fall down in and all this, and trying to keep people calm and so he can beam them out. And just seeing her take that leadership role all of a sudden of leading people and standing up and say, you know, I need everybody that's going this way to come this way, and, you know, trust me, well, I'm going to take care of you. We're going to get you out of here. And, you know, she's just, you know, a young woman. She's a teenager at this time, but this is definitely where we start to see the Kira Nerys that becomes a leader.
Yeah, and one of the final things we see in the novel is Basso running to Dukat with a image of Kira doing this and saying, look what she's done, look what she's done. And that's kind of where this is left. There's a thing that ties into something in season 1 of Deep Space Nine that I kept expecting right in this bit at the end of the novel, but now I'm like, okay, I guess that must be in the next novel that they make that explicitly clear. But there's just this really cool thing that they tie into that shows that Dukat is like, in a weird way, looking out for Kira during this time. And it's weird and creepy.
Oh, no.
Well, I mean, no, we'll talk about it in a couple weeks, I'm sure. But yeah, that whole bit at the end I thought was interesting. And then, of course, we get that epilogue that shows that things are going to tie in and continue in book 3. So all of that said, after an hour and 10 minutes of talking about this novel, Bruce, what are your final thoughts and anything that we missed talking about this novel?
I think I realized as we're talking through this that I like this novel a little more than I thought, because I think because we're learning more about Ro's backstory and a little bit of Odo's and Kira's and Dukat's and Damar's and on and on and on, I think I like the different story elements that played back and forth, and it just seemed like I said, a history book of these are the events that took place this year, and then we fast forward another year or two or whatever, and these are the events that played out this year, that, you know, and we just kind of see that build up. So I did enjoy getting to know these more familiar characters in this setting, because it was something I always thought about when I watched Deep Space Nine. And yeah, I've often thought about the occupation and how that started too. But like we talked earlier, book 1 has a different feel than book 2. But I would say in a lot of ways I probably had a little more fun with book 2 than I did with book 1. Book 1's very serious and very dark in a way. And this has dark moments too, but there's some lighter moments in here for me as well. So I would say that I'm going to give this book 4.5 out of 5 Dajaras that we shouldn't have to have anymore.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. I really enjoy this novel. The change in the storytelling I noticed quite a bit from book 1 to book 2. But again, I don't think that's a bad thing. It's just a different way of telling the story. And I love the little touchstones that James Swallow left for them to kind of pick up and run with. I love Deep Space Nine so much. So seeing the characters that we know and love, and some that we hate from Deep Space Nine, love to hate maybe, I don't know, get their backstories in this and what they're doing at this time and how they're living. Even Win Adami she's not even a Vedic yet at this point, but just to see her personality come through a little bit, where she's like, they're like, "Oh, Win, you always come by and with great religious counsel and blah, blah, blah." And she's like, "And yet I'm still a lowly Ranjan." I'm just like, oh, I love it. These authors have the characters' voices down so well. And then, building on these characters that we've just seen a little tiny bit of, or creating these brand new characters that feel fully fleshed out, it really makes this period of history come alive. And there's some dark parts. It's dark, like you said. We know not everything's going to end well in this novel because we're only partway through the occupation, and we know it's going to get worse before it gets better. But we know that eventually dawn is coming, right? We've got Dawn of the Eagles, the next novel, and we know the occupation is going to end eventually. So I'm really eager to finish this story up. It's been so long, I don't remember exactly how it all goes, but I've really enjoyed this reread. And so this time around, I think I'm going to give this novel, I'm going to say 4 out of 5 Balon-powered fighters that are used as decoys.
There you go. Okay, cool.
So we'd love to hear your thoughts, dear listeners, about this novel. So reach out to us, positivelytrek@gmail.com or Twitter @positivelytrek. We also have the Positively Trek discussion group on Facebook and our Goodreads group, where we list all the novels that we're going to be talking about, and we have discussions happening about all the books and comics that make up the Star Trek literary universe. And Bruce, if people want to talk to you about their thoughts on this novel or anything else, where can they contact you?
Well, you can come to my house. I live at... No, that's not a good idea. You can find me on Twitter @Admiral_Rex. That's Admiral_ the underline Rex. And of course, you can find me in our Facebook discussion group.
Excellent. And you can find me on Twitter @Kertrats. That's KERTRATS. And youtube.com/KertratsProductions. And also make sure to check out patreon.com/positivelytrek if you're interested in helping out the show. We really appreciate it, but we really mostly appreciate you listening. So thank you so much for listening.
And then also, since you like books, and if you're going to be at Star Trek Mission Chicago, check us out on Friday. I'm going to be there moderating a panel about Star Trek books and comics. So check out the website and app for more details.
Oh, man, that's so awesome. I can't wait to see you there. I will not be there, unfortunately. I really wish I could be there.
No, you're there in spirit.
I want to be there in person.
I'll mention your name to everybody.
Aw, thank you. Well, thank you all so much for listening, and we will see you in the next episode. Until then, as always, stay positive.